So hello everyone and welcome once again to another lovely session. One of those Sundays where we meet a lot of very exciting speakers to teach us about a couple of things that we did not know, but now we'll be abreast with. Today we have two exciting experts and lesson speakers. I read quite at length about them. It was exciting to see their profiles and what they've done before. I must also indicate that this session started last year, October. We ended the first module first week in January, about 9 or so lessons already taught. We started the second session 2 weeks ago, had the first lesson. This is the second lesson for the year. The session should end somewhere in June. But today we've been joined by two very exciting speakers to tell us and teach us, lecture us, determine the scope of the lecture about democracy, human rights, and active global citizenship education. First speaker is Dr. Katarina Popovic. I hope I got the name rightly pronounced. And Dr. Henry Charles, that comes easy. So two speakers, Dr. Katarina Popovic will be the first person to give us the lessons, and then Dr. Henry Charles will follow suit. I want to allow both of them to determine how they want to go about it. But the two of them will tell us briefly about themselves, and then Dr. Katarina Popovic will take over. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, for the start. And I'm really glad that I can share some of my ideas and experiences with global citizenship education with you today, since I'm very passionate about this topic and I consider it really, really important, especially for the modern times we live in. So I will take you to the short journey. I'll start with a short historical overview on citizenship education. Then I will take you around the globe, again, briefly, of course, to see how does it look like around the globe, and then some of the topics that are included in citizenship education. And of course, there will be some concepts, some narratives, some discourses behind different meaning of citizenship education. And at the end, I will also present you briefly the concept of public pedagogy, and you will see if you haven't, if you're not familiar with it, then you will see why is it important today for the citizenship education. So can I share my screen? Am I allowed to? No, not yet. Because yes, I prepared PowerPoint. Okay. Okay. No, I still can't. I think you have to either allow screen sharing or make me a co-host. I'm not sure, but let me see. No, not yet.
I guess maybe a co-host.
Yeah, maybe that's, now I can, perfect. Okay, so let me see, where is it? Here it is, here it is. So you can please confirm if you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Yes, okay, good. So it's about citizenship, but you see from the very beginning that I say active and global citizenship education. So I'm not happy if we stick to the simple civic or citizenship education, and that will be one of my goals for this session, to try to convince you why global citizenship and active citizenship education is important. And we will see, we'll discuss at the end if you think it makes sense. So as I said, I will start first with a very short historical overview. Citizenship education as a term, it's quite new, but as an idea, as an approach, it's relatively old. And we have some beginnings in the ancient Greece and in some other cultures and world regions also. But in a modern turn, in a modern meeting, usually we start with Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, 1798, so the French Revolution, and more modern, United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's the declaration of citizens, of men and women around the globe, no matter what nation, race, and so on. So it's declaration of citizens of the world. And that's where we start thinking and talking about modern concept of citizen. And in the beginning, you know, the elements of this understanding what a citizen and citizenship is was freedom, justice, and peace. Even in the United Nations in the beginning, they were talking about freedom, justice, and peace. And since it was the time after the Second World War, of course, that was the crucial part of this. But then later, United Nations developed this concept, and they have added social rights, political rights, human rights. And, you know, with the development of modern democracies, some new elements were coming into that, especially democracy and human rights. And my dear colleague Henry will talk about it later. So we have to note that this concept, citizenship, is always developed, or was always developed, in relation to the state, a nation state. Oh, a citizen is a citizen of a certain country or of a certain nation. Oh, there is a noise in my channels. Is it okay now? Can I continue?
Yes, you can.
Okay, good. So there is always a country or a state or a nation, and people who live there are citizens of this country or state, and they have certain relationship. Well, you can immediately see or feel that it's very much Western-shaped concept of citizenship. So because of the Western European and of course a North American type of democracies and type of the states, they are very much shaping, and still they do. Still they do. Just the modern times have broadened this, this idea of citizenship that was at the very beginning and for a long time shaped by the Western understanding. And what is this, the core of this Western understanding? Well, there is a state or a country, there are citizens, and they should behave according to the certain norms, accepted norms, desirable norms. And the education has the task to transfer these norms to the citizens and to educate them according to these norms. So then there was a whole development, especially when UN started to work more on it, from this behaving, you know, behaving nicely as a good citizen, to this notion of a very critical or active member of the society, being it local or global. So historically seen, you can see all those concepts, and you can also read and follow from civic education. We move slowly to more active citizenship. It's not just you behave, but you do some actions. Then education for democratic citizenship, which is again very much Western or even European. Today we talk more about global citizenship education. But whatever we talk about, there are always two elements that we can observe. First one is there is always some higher authority at whatever level it might be. There is a relationship to the either state or a nation or certain authority. And of course, this relationship can differ, but it's always an element. And the other one, citizenship always has to do with identity. So sometimes it's related to your, you know, formal identity, like passport. So where do you belong? Where are you registered? Okay, we have a dynamic communication channel. So there is always an issue. Okay, there is a formal part. Where do I belong? Where is my passport? But there is also, how do I feel? And these parts, these elements are interconnected, sometimes also opposing, and so on. So we can very often observe this. Just to confirm or to illustrate my thesis about, so this not only mine, of course, it was observed by many authors, but I'm transferring it to you about this European or Western shape understanding. This is a very typical definition of Council of Europe, education for democratic citizenship. And you see very traditional knowledge, skills, understanding, attitudes and behavior, exercise and defend democratic rights and responsibilities, play an active part in democratic life, and so on. Basically, what you see behind it is an idea. We already have a democratic society, at least in Europe. So the only task of the people is to learn about it and then to behave accordingly. Well, it sounds very nice, but just the reality is a little bit different, but we will see about it later. So then I said I will take you to this short journey around the globe. What does citizenship mean around the globe? Good citizen and active citizenship. Okay, I mentioned already this Western European notion, like political engagement in a democracy. There is already a democracy, and it's a right of a common people So not the policymaker, but of common people to take part in decision making. So it's not only up to the governments. So the common people, the citizen, normal citizen, they have the right, but also the duty to participate in the political life, in the decision making. And that's the task to prepare them belongs to education for democratic citizenship. If we move to the North America, it looks a little bit different because, of course, in Europe, there is this tradition of relationship between state and the citizens, which is quite was increasing. This participatory element was increasing during over the time. And there was a tradition of the welfare state. While in North America, we have more of this economic aspect that shaped the understanding. And in North America, it's more like an active participation in a sovereign political community. But what this political community is, that could be quite different. And I also have to say that the usual notion of citizenship does not appear so much, at least not in this understanding that we see in Europe, but under the other names, other titles, we can find elements of this active citizenship. For example, Occupy Wall Street or Black Lives Matters. This movement brought quite a lot of this idea of active citizenship to prepare people for that and to engage them, to move them. But if you say a citizenship education, no one would probably think of Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street, but basically that's it. So, but this is on another spectrum of this formal understanding of citizenship. Now moving to Africa, and since we have several students from Africa, they will know very well what I'm talking about. So Africa's understanding of citizenship is very much shaped by the colonial past. And for a long time, the understanding of citizenship was related to the country that was a colonial power. And I will not name them singly, you know very well what I'm talking about. But being a citizen of an African country was sometimes being a citizen of British Empire, although people didn't have any direct relationship in terms of that wasn't their lived experience. So when things change and in the process of decolonialization, that was the notion that was abandoned. And many African countries were looking for a new kind of identity and for the new understanding of the citizenship. So one of the prominent terms is the Ubuntu. And this is an understanding of citizenship, which is very much related to the African experience and to the communities in Africa. And it's very much related to the striving to non-material order, to the spirituality. It's about common understanding, supporting each other in the community, in the country. It's having a respect to the people and to the environment, to the natural environment. Well, some of the authors in this field, they say, well, as a matter of fact, this is very close to our modern understanding, global modern understanding of citizenship. We talk education of sustainable development. It's about the people. It's about environment. So it's very close. It's very not so different. Maybe it's true, but still it's good to see the difference and how it developed differently through the process of decolonialization. In Latin America, of course, again, colonial past, but in a different way. In Latin America today, that's what we have to keep in mind, is the country, the region, world region with the highest economic and social gaps. So the gap between rich and poor is the highest in the world. So what we see there is the idea of citizenship very much related to the social movement, to the political and social power and power fights. And very often it's seen as a weapon to in the struggle against this exclusion, inequality, weapon in struggling for the social justice and more equality in the region. Completely different, again, very diverse, but still different, is Asia. Asia is very diverse in terms it's multi-ethnic, it's multi-religious, it's multilingual. So it's difficult to talk about one understanding of citizenship in Asia. But for a big part of the region, an important Confucian tradition plays an important role. And to put it very briefly and simplified, Confucian tradition talks about the rule of virtue and the duty. And the duty is towards the authority, towards the higher power, towards the state, and not so much about the right of the individual. Some authors even say that's the root of the so-called soft authoritarianism that we see in some of the Asian countries. And they even compare it with the kind of authoritarianism that we have in countries of in post-communism. This tradition of authoritarianism that was inherited and is still there. So especially civil society in Asia, they are now trying through citizenship to support emancipation of economically and socially deprived groups. And they talk much more about also human rights, minority rights, and so on. Arab region is again extreme, and you have the richest country in Arab region and the poorest one. It's very diverse, but also very unstable. Some of the worst armed conflicts we have today, we have in Arab region. So that's another reason why it's difficult to talk about citizenship. So, but one thing is, it's quite typical for most of the countries. It's very much mixed with national and religious identity. So citizenship, while in some countries it's completely indifferent from religion, in Arab region, it's still very much related. And for the civil society, for example, whose work I follow and know very well, it's quite difficult because religious identity and religious issues are always related to some authority, religious authority, national authority, and citizenship seems to be or tries to be somehow independent and talk more about individual rights or rights of the certain groups, especially excluded group, vulnerable groups, and so on. So we have different concepts, so mixing and sometimes opposing each other. So there is no common concept on a global level about citizenship, and we see the whole range of understanding. On one hand, people are relating it and connecting it with patriotism, with national or even national discourses, and they think they talk about citizenship, that's their understanding. On the other hand, we have, especially in the civil society, very strong understanding of citizenship related to the main kind, more universal, participation, inclusion of everyone, especially minorities, vulnerable groups, and so on. So we see the whole spectrum of understandings. So, but now I want to go, to the earth, to some of the data. We talk about citizenship, and I said at the beginning, there is an issue of belonging. And is it like emotionally or having a passport? And look, we talk about citizenship in the world where there are around 10 million stateless people. And if you have ever made this experience, and I did for some time, 20 years ago, we had the civil war in my country, and the big country where I was born has separated. Now we have like 6, 7, 8, I cannot count them anymore. So I've been through this period where you don't know what is the name of the country. And so you really don't know, at least formally, where we are. It's an awful feeling. So currently, because of the refugees, wars, armed conflicts, we have around 10 million people who are stateless. And officially reported, are around 4.2 million. So these 10 millions are not officially reported, but it's quite reliable data since it's coming from United Nations agency that is dealing with that. And additionally, almost 80 million forcible displaced people. So I'm talking about end of 2019. So obviously it's increasing. I mean, we had some new wars and so on. There are still no data that include the refugees from Ukraine, the war that is right now going on. But so these figures are shocking. So what kind of citizenship we are talking about when we talk about these people? So you see the figures here. I think they are saying enough. This is another chart. So again, talking about people who are either stateless or displaced and so on. And you have also the top hosted countries and top source countries. As I said, Ukraine is still not there. And there are slightly changes. It might be that Afghanistan is now at the top after this disaster in August in Afghanistan. And then Venezuela very high for already sometimes, Syria already very high. For some people, they don't know about South Sudan and Myanmar. but they're also very high in the number of the refugees and forcibly displaced people. So we have now the whole shift that I mentioned from this traditional understanding of a good citizen who behaves correctly according to the norms to this global citizenship. What are the factors that caused this paradigm shift, this different understanding? So there are several processes. For example, in Europe, to start with Europe, because I said that's the birthplace of this traditional understanding, there is European integration and European Union. Now, suddenly there is European Union identity and national identity is less important. But we saw that it wasn't really so successful. And for example, how Brexit did oppose this understanding is a good example. But there is also a work of several supranational organizations. I mentioned here UN and UNESCO, but there are also some organizations working on a pan-Arab level or pan-African level. So there are international organizations working more across countries, across regions. There are some banks and many projects and activities. So they have supported this idea that we are not only citizens of our own country, but citizens of a bigger region and maybe even the world. Another factor is the weaker nation state. I mentioned it in Europe, but we also see with the increased globalization, the nation state is not playing such an important role anymore. But I have to say the COVID-19 pandemic might change this. We have, again, a rebirth of nation state and the kind of nationalism, new nationalism inspired by pandemic. The countries are closing their boundaries. They're isolating increasingly themselves, trying to protect themselves from the others who might bring the virus. And of course, sharing the vaccines only for their own citizens and not really having this idea of supporting the others, especially when it comes to vaccine. There are big discussions right now because we know that European countries are striving to vaccinate as much as they can, 90%, 100%, while in Africa, no more than 20% of people are vaccinated. So we talk about new kind of nationalism caused by pandemic. But so this is opposing factor. We will see how it will develop. Another tendency that supported this global citizenship is decolonization that I mentioned already, and strong social movements that are connecting each other. All those revolutions or social movements I have mentioned occupy Wall Street, but then it took different shape in different countries. People were protesting against gentrification, and they were opposing some of these tendencies coming from a global corporate world and so on. And they were connecting each other. World Social Forum is probably the biggest one or the most famous one. Civil society is continuously working on a various raising of global issues and need to connect with people, not staying in our national boundaries. And here I mention a few other factors that you are aware of, so just to keep them in mind, like globalization, ICT, digital debt connects us. It has some advantages, but some risk as well. But let's stay there now to connecting elements. Economy is becoming more global, especially transcultural and transnational capitalism, the culture, and some other elements. Financial crisis was one of the first that showed us in a very painful way how globally we are, whether we like it or not. There were a few big American banks that caused the financial crisis and then crashed, and the whole world fell into the crisis. So no matter, a few greedy American bankers, they caused the consequences for the whole world, more or less, but we all felt this. Migrant and refugee crisis. That's what I keep saying to my colleagues in Europe. You can be fully unaware of what's going on in Afghanistan or Syria or Venezuela. But when the migrants are coming to your country, don't ask where do they come from or why. Ask yourself what your government did so they came. They had to leave their home and place where they live. So you have to be aware of those things that are going around the globe, because you will see the consequences, at least as a people who are expelled from their homes and who are looking for the new home, maybe in your country. Of course, climate crisis and climate change and environmental degradation, I think it's the most obvious currently factor that supports this feeling of, oh, we are all living in one world. Because what happens in the Amazon forest in Brazil, we feel it directly. Or many other elements related to the environment and climate change, I don't even need to mention. I think it's a very popular topic. We all know quite a lot about it. I mentioned pandemic and COVID-19. Oh, a Chinese guy ate, what is this, the name of this animal that caused the COVID-19 virus, never mind. But you know, so it spread it around the globe very, very fast. Well, this is one of the many pandemics. We had the swine flu and we had the chicken flu, and who knows what's coming. But it's showing that we are very vulnerable and very connected. I don't think the answer is to close the national borders, obviously. So we have to think more globally in order to prevent or mitigate those crises in the future. And of course, all those populism, authoritarianism, right-wing movements, xenophobia, human rights violations, this is also affecting us, even if it's not happening in our own country. But unfortunately, it is happening more and more in many, many other countries. So what are the, what are the elements of this new global citizenship education? In the past, it was enough that you know the laws of your country, you know how you should behave, you go and vote, maybe you take part in some local community activity, you take care about your environment in your village or a city or a community, and that's it. Oh, lovely. Well, that's not enough anymore, as I show, because of the many factors. So what does it include? Many elements. It's becoming really a challenging area. So this peace, sensitivity, openness towards the others. I just mentioned the example with the refugees. So you have to be aware of peace or threats for the peace in different parts of the world. Intercultural education is an important part of this, and of course, prevention of violence, extremism, genocide, violation of human rights. You will hear more about this from Henry, but this is a part of this global citizenship again. Then this developing this international perspective, international understanding. Just taking care about your own community is not enough anymore, because it's only one part of your belonging, and we do belong to the bigger world, and you need to develop this and to have this global perspective and global solidarity. Cosmopolitanism is the world that is maybe not so common anymore, but I still like it, and I think it does express this global citizenship. In a modern term. Education for sustainable development and everything around environment and climate change and so on does belong to this, and it is one of the most important elements today of global citizenship education. Climate change, of course. Recycling your own garbage and so on, sorry, but that's not enough anymore. There are things going on in other parts of the world, and they're affecting us. So this is about the content. Of course, there are many other issues also, for example, gender and so on, many others. But so just to put it in the nutshell, what are the most important elements? But there is another aspect that I also want to share. What is global citizenship about? On one hand, it's about having information, having knowledge, but that's by far not enough. Because, you know, you can have a lecture about why we shouldn't be nationalist or racist and so on, and we listen to the lecture and that's it. Well, that's not enough, and we have experienced that. Many types of citizenship education and political education were limited to, well, lecture or flyers, you know, some posters and so on. That's not enough. Raising awareness, raising consciousness, raising sensibility for this kind of issues is also important. It means you need to touch emotions. You need to go with this kind, if you want to work in this kind of education, you need to develop, to go under the skin, to touch people's emotions, because then you can turn knowledge into the action. If people are not emotional, evolved, untouched, they will stick to the theoretical knowledge and they will not move further. And that's the third element that we need to do. We need action. We need engagement, because that's a moral choice. It's not a matter of if you want to engage in global issue, you want to be solidar or not. So it's a moral choice, because in the modern world, we cannot simply stay aside. The level of engagement, type of engagement, that's different. That's another issue. But so this being global citizen is a moral choice and requires certain actions, depending on the part of the world where you live in. And now I want to show you two videos, very short videos, to show you the difference between citizenship education and active global citizenship education. Okay, so I will just for a moment stop share this one, and I will start with, where is my YouTube? Here it is. Okay, so this is the first one. Okay, so you can, if I would
We
ask
live
you now,
on a wonderful planet
sorry,
with
still
so
going on.
much biodiversity of animals and plants.
Just stop it.
But
okay, so if I would ask you to whom it is addressed, I'm sure you would immediately recognize someone who has a car, someone who has a house, and there are, of course, there is a light, and then choose this type of batteries or the other type of batteries, and don't take shower too long. And they don't even ask, what about people who do not have a car, who do not have a water in their houses? And there are hundreds of millions of them around the globe. And they cannot choose what batteries to use because they don't have any batteries. No, this is like, you know, a nice European or maybe North American or Australian one with a house and a car. And, you know, oh, I can choose if I take a shower for 5 minutes or 10. Now I will show you another one. Okay, so this is in German, but then I have caption translation in, oh, sorry, here it is done, in English. So follow the translation, and I will cut off the tone or
the bright side of life. Willkommen in deiner Kobaltmine, liebe Ankapseln aus Hamburg-Blankenese. Hier im Kongo schiffen wir den Rohstoff für die Batterie von deinem Elektroauto und arbeiten Tag und Nacht für deine Klimabilanz. Hey Leute, Ann-Kathrin kann ihren Frappuccino to go bei Klimanotrai holen. Hey, das so, ich kann dich nicht hören. Hoppala, Stall eingestürzt. Naja, also Kobaltstaub ist eben kein Brokkoli, der ist hochgiftig. Diese Atemschutzmasken mit 2 A2P-Filtern und Luftstromindikator kann sich ja keiner leisten. Vorteil? Weniger Plastikmüll. Ach ja, Kind und Karriere muss im 21. Jahrhundert kein Widerspruch sein. Bei uns machen sogar ziemlich viele Kinder Karriere. Die wären zwar auch gerne auf eine Fridays for Future Demo gegangen, geht aber nicht. Viel zu viel Arbeit. Aber zum Glück kannst du ja mit deinen Kindern mit deinem neuen E-Auto zur Demo fahren. Oh, Mittagspause. es hier was Vernünftiges zu essen gibt, ist jeden Tag ein Glücksspiel. Aber ganz unter uns, an Katrin, das ist in den europäischen Kantinen nicht anders. Was ist denn da los? Tesla auf Rekord hoch. Wichtiger als ranziger Hirsepreis, ohnehin das gute Gefühl zu wissen, wofür man arbeitet. Wenn wir Arbeiter das Kobalt aus der Erde geschaufelt haben, landet es bei uns Milizen, liebe Ann-Kathrin. Und glaub mir, kein Coaching motiviert mehr als Milizionär im Nacken. Wir verkaufen das Kobalt an die chinesischen Händler und kaufen uns von dem Erlös Waffen für den Bürgerkrieg. So wie die hier. Oh, die ist ja cool. Darf ich mal? Die Chinesen verkaufen das Kobalt an die Batteriehersteller, die ihre Batterie wiederum an VW, Tesla und Co. liefern. Und so kommt das Kobalt auch schließlich zu dir. Liebe Ann-Kathrin, wir gratulieren dir zu deinem neuen Elektroauto und hoffen, dass es dank unserer Hilfe fährt und fährt und fährt. Liebe Grüße aus dem Herzen der Energiewende. Und übrigens, ich soll dir von den Kollegen aus der Diamantmine noch ganz herzlich zu deiner Verlobung gratulieren.
So at the end from the diamond mine, because she obviously got a nice ring with the diamond at the end. So I think it's quite, they made it like funny, to look it like funny, but I think it's quite bitter and shows the reality of the world. This, as I show, first one, that would be a message for active citizen in Europe, USA, Australia, and so on. But if we don't change the approach and go to the second one and develop this really global understanding for the world and for the people in other countries in the region, then, well, not only people, some people, but also the planet will, there will be nothing to save in a few years. And I hope this understanding is rising now, but I think especially us in education sector have to work on this more global understanding and developing sensitivities on the global issues. But I have a few more slides to share. So let me just find again my presentation. Here it is. Okay. Oh, no. Okay, so I will not show everything, but just a part of this. Okay, so now I will skip this one, some of the examples. What I also want to show you, there are very often we talk about, there are no funds. There are no funds for education, for citizenship education, for improving this and that. So there is a very clear way to show it's not about lack of resources. This is simply not truth. It's about priorities. So what you can see here, this gray part, military expenditures, annually military expenditures. And what you see here is what is needed for education. Well, there are different kinds of calculation. You know this UN program, Education for All, part of Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals, education for everyone. In the poor country, that's what's needed, $200 billion. But if you compare it to and that's until 2030. If you compare it with the military expenditures per year, it's nothing, it's peanuts. It's peanuts. So almost $2 trillion. I have counted, it's 12 zeros. Just to write down this number, this figure, you need 12 zeros. And just for education, until 2030, that's what we need. So when they say no resources, scarce resources, this is simply not truth. And there are many examples like this. I just wanted to show this one because military expenditures are like, they're taking as normal. Here are a few more data. Okay, so that's the data, 1.9 trillion 2019. I've read, but I didn't check for the last year, so I don't know if they have updated this. So it's almost $2 trillion. And if you take United Nations, you see their budget is 1.8. It's nothing compared to the world's military expenditure. And we expect UN to take care of global peace and to have actions and so on. Another expenditure, trillions of dollars goes to the subsidies of fossil fuels. Yeah, fossil fuels, we have to limit them, green economy, and they still support very much fossil fuels economy, continuously. So in the last 20 years, this is the United States, they spent more than 2 trillion waging war and nation building in Afghanistan. Needless to say, they failed spectacularly failed. The capital of Afghanistan, so Kabul, the city I've been in and I love so much, and the people there. So, I mean, quite people who are not like, oh, war greedy, normal, nice, lovely people who would like to live in peace. Well, they did not fail. Someone betrayed them. Someone who invested so many trillions of dollars to build the war, the peace in Afghanistan. Probably there were some other intentions, otherwise it wouldn't fail so much. Or this comparison, the poorest half of the Earth's population, so the lower half in terms of economy, owns 1% of the Earth's wealth. And guess how many the richest 1%? Almost half, almost half. And I mentioned that the resources that are scarce. So no, they are not. The developed world is throwing about 1.3 billion tons of food over a year. This is approximately a third of the all food we grow, just throwing away. And then we talk about scarce resources. Okay, a few more data. This one is shocking. This is like a few years ago, the famous journal Lancet, they have published this data. They did a long-term study and a lot of analysis, and they did show that obesity is now killing triple the number of people who die from malnutrition, and more people die of obesity. So for the first time in the history, obesity and the diseases that are related to or caused by obesity, for the first time in the history, people die more, some people, because they have more, too much to eat, than those who are starving. So it's about sharing resources, not about lack of resources. There are estimations, they are shocking one, it's a really sad data, that around every minute, some people say every 7 seconds, a certain number of children or people die because of hunger and its consequences. I compared different data. They say, oh, every 7 seconds a child dies. They say, no, every minute, 7 people, 15 people, no matter, doesn't matter. So any of these figures is simply shocking. I mentioned fossil industry, and just recently when I was preparing this input, I found that calculation done by International Monetary Fund that fossil fuel industry receives subsidies $11 million per minute at the global level. If you take global level and calculate everything together, per minute, $11 million per minute for fossil fuel industry. And you will hear them on those important meetings and so, oh, we need green economies. Really? Why do you subsidize the fossil fuel industry? At the same time, about 80% of a population lives on less than $10 a day. At the same time, the CEO, the director of a big US company, earns about 10.3 million a year. How many cars, how many apartments, how many villas can you buy for this amount of money? And this comes from a Portuguese guy, a Brazilian guy, who is doing this kind of a calculation. He has an institute in Brazil, and they produce quite an interesting statistics. And they took the whole GDP for the whole world, and they have shared it, they distributed it among the inhabitants of the earth. So if you calculate it that way, each of the persons in the world would have $3,800 per month. More than enough for a decent life. So it's not about resources, it's about sharing. And now you may wonder, why am I showing these guys? So they're not especially handsome, and you probably guess that I'm not very fond of them. So why am I showing those guys? Well, you will see. Here are they. Here are they. So I don't know if you can see it or show me. This is the research done by Oxfam. These 8 men, they possess, they possess the wealth, the same amount of wealth as the lower, more poorer part of population, which is approximately 3.6 billion people. So if you take 3.6 billion people on the earth, and those 8 guys, there is no single woman among them. This is also showing something about the culture we live in, and that's approximately the amount. I think this is the best picture of the world we know. And if you think that something changed during the COVID, look at this. They get even richer. So you see, this red one is March 2020 and January 2021. So I don't have the recent data, but this shows approximately after 1 year of pandemic. Look, where is Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and so on. And if you take, for example, one-off emergency tax, so it's a very small amount of their wealth, of their pandemic windfalls, you could fund COVID-19 jobs for the entire world, the vaccination for the entire world with one-off emergency tax. But still, we don't have it. No, Elon Musk is flying to the cosmos. Okay, so what I'm saying, why is this global citizenship very much needed? We are not in the same boat. Yes, in terms of the planet, but still we are in a very different position. We are in the same storm. It was the pandemic-19 storm, it's a climate change storm, but still some people are stranded. Some come on the small ships, the others on the big yachts, on the big ships. That makes a crucial difference. And the discussion in the pandemic, like, oh, we are all in the same boats and all suffer. Come on. I mean, physical distance is so much appreciated in Europe. We have someone from Denmark here. If you have been during the pandemic in Denmark, you probably remember, keep physical distances. Oh, really? Tell me how to keep it in India. Oh, we need to work from home, home office. How should people in Africa do this if they do their daily living through going out? Share with them, how do you think they should behave responsible? Tell them, explain them how to do it. Respect human rights. So that's how government in Serbia, this is Serbia, that's how they respected human rights. They chose the opportunity to kill the opposition, to kill every political voice that they disliked. And here, digital skills, I mean, these digital skills, passion and everything is around digital skills. That's the solution for all the problems. Oh, really? How do you do this and increase digital skills and online learning if you teach in slums in Brazil? So we are not in the same boat. We are in the same storm, but it's quite different. And I believe the citizenship does not take this into account, but stay limited, in our small community and doesn't have a broader view. It's not a citizenship. If it's not global, it's not citizenship. If it's not active, it's not citizenship. It's only washing the hands. You know the expression, I'm sure. I'm washing my hands. I'm recycling my garbage. I'm going voting. I do a course in a local educational center, and that's it. No, if it's not active, if it's not global, it's not citizenship. If it's not talking about universal human rights and taking global problems, it's not citizenship. What solutions they offer to us? During the pandemic, that's what we heard. And I found this one, for example, and I couldn't but laugh. The young people who live in Rio de Janeiro favelas, I had the opportunity to visit those favelas, and they are telling me the blockchain can transform their lives. Oh, really? It's not about injustice. It's not about a Brazilian government, corrupted Brazilian government that is destroying the resources and so on. It's not about corrupting the USA government, the others and companies that are using this corruptive government connection to destroy the lives of the people in Brazil and to destroy the resources. No, we offer them blockchains and they will transform their lives. I mean, it's simply silly. It's funny. This is the photo that I made in UNESCO a few years ago, just before the pandemic. Again, you can't believe that that's true, but UNESCO invited a person. She's CEO of some, American company, digital solutions platform. And it was about illiteracy. It's International Literacy Day, September, UNESCO, and they were invited to promote their learning platform, and they said this literacy gaps. It's about literacy, the conference. So we're talking about literacy gap. If they use their platforms, you can close the gap. It means make people literate in 3 minutes. Have you ever worked in literacy? Have you ever met illiterate people? In 3 minutes, I was speechless. And of course, artificial intelligence and online platforms will solve all the problems. This is something that is the solution, magical solution and silver bullet, and everything will be bridged, all the gaps will be bridged and all the problems. Now we don't talk anymore, for example, don't talk so much about right to education, human right to education. We talk about right to connectivity. So if you're connected, the problems are solved. So what is forgotten is this global architecture, power, and all the global problems. And of course, it was Einstein who said, we can solve the problems by using the same kind of thinking and the same approach we used when we created them. So business as usual will not help. So the complete change of approach and transformative approach is something that is needed. And my time is over, so I will just run through the topic. And if you're interested, we can maybe talk a bit about it later. The whole new sphere, the whole new approach called public pedagogy. That's what I'm very much involved in. And this is, I see it as a new space for citizenship education, the way, the understanding of citizenship education I was talking about. There is the private sphere, and there is the governmental sphere, so like also schools, education system, and so on. There is economic sphere, there are big companies and so on. And in the middle, there is this public sphere. It could be public spaces, open public spaces, or spaces that citizens share, streets, parks, avenues, public buildings, libraries, and so on. And that's where a new citizenship is being promoted and created. Here, since you will get the presentation, there are 3 names that I would recommend you that develop and promote this kind of public pedagogy. Well, I don't really like the name because of this pedagogy. It's point to the children. And here we talk more about adult citizens. So I would call it public andragogy, but okay. So Henrik Giraud and Elizabeth Elsford and Gerd Biesta recommended reading for that. And here are some of the examples. So you just get an idea of what we are talking about. Public spaces where people bring their ideas, they share ideas, so they discuss and so on. Or also, places where they organize protests, symbolic protests, where they oppose, being it the banks, for example, the Occupy Wall Street and so on, but also protesting against international mechanisms that support neoliberal economy and global corporations and so on. This one was against oppression of a woman. So women were protesting, I think it's Athens, in front of the parliament. So different actions going on. This is learning by doing. This is information, but also emotion. You remember I said emotions must be touched, and this is also engagement. You do, and through doing, you learn about it, you acquire knowledge and attitude and behavior, not only by listening. So if we would be else somewhere and having this live without COVID, I would probably invite you to go out and to organize something. This is, again, some of the examples. Public pedagogy is about breaking boundaries, raising awareness by unexpected behavior, by being loud, be organized, being together, use the space in an alternative way. Bring new equipment, organize actions, draw attention of the people to the issues that are global. Fridays for Future, although they are quite a lot best shaped, but still we can take them as an example of public pedagogy. Fridays for Future or actions after within the Black Lives Matters, or all these, orange revolutions and other colorful revolutions we had. This is a way of learning, not in the classroom, but in the public spaces, because that's where the citizens are. That's where the citizens meet and exchange and start action. This is again some of the similar actions. This was in USA, Mexico. It was about against gentrification, industrialization, using public spaces or nature to build, corporate buildings and so on. There are plenty of processes around that. So finally, in the end, of course, I'm now open for your questions, for your comments, for your experiences. And I offer here a few questions if you want to talk about or to mention. Which approach or which way of thinking would you choose if you talk about citizenship? What do you see as the biggest challenge today? I have mentioned some of them, but maybe you would add something or pick up one of them as especially important. Which aspects of all those that I have mentioned is closest to you personally and to your experience? What can you do, or do you think about it? What could I do as a global citizen? And where do you see hope? Where do you see strengths and supportive tendencies at a national or global level for this kind of active global citizenship education that I've described you? So just in inspiration for the discussion. So I hope it was quite a long presentation, quite a long input, but I do hope there was some food for thoughts for you, and I'm looking forward for your questions, comments, and so on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Katarina. And I think your presentation cut across the whole globe. The examples you gave, somewhere in Africa, others in Europe, and I think participants might have enjoyed that a lot. I would have suggested that we take your questions now, but I'll recommend that Dr. Henry Charles does his presentation, and if you have the rest of the minute to take the questions, and then those whose questions may not be answered can send emails, and then those questions can be answered. So, Doctor, if that is fine by you and Dr. Henry.
Yes, I'm okay. Yeah.
Great. All right. So, Dr. Henry, you can take the floor, and then right after the presentation, we can take the questions for both of you. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Let me try and
also to indicate that participants can also send their questions to the chat session, so that when we get to the questions, we just read them out and then answer them. Thank you very much, everyone.
Let me just try and. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I am in the invitation that I received. Of course, I think the request was to share some thoughts on the whole issue of democracy and human rights. And of course, some in a broad context, and really for me to decide what kind of approach I would take. Trying to straddle between my own life and time and part in advocacy and in movements, youth labor movement and others, and also, the whole academic component of it. I decided to entitle my presentation today, Democracy, Power, Structural Inequality, and Social Justice. And like I say, some points for consideration. So there's some elements of what Katarina has raised, which you would see would fit in nicely. A question, of course, there's been, from since I know myself growing up to today, there has been a healthy, well, not always healthy, sometimes it gets very toxic, but a very healthy debate, discourse around democracy, this notion, this concept of democracy. Now, here is what my experience has been in terms of this. It was around 1968, 1969. I remember I was in primary school still, just 1 year before going into transitioning to secondary education. And my school teacher at the time, a gentleman, he kept drilling into my head this definition or concept of democracy. And he said to me, democracy is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Now, it's interesting upon reflection, maybe at the time, I did not have the privilege or the luxury of contextualizing what he was saying. But upon reflection, it's interesting that that definition was being, propagated and whatever. It was around the time of the Vietnam War, in which the US, of course, United States and others, the United States largely was involved in a war in Vietnam. It was at the height of the civil rights movement that had been going on for a while. From a Caribbean, and I just say also in Africa, you had what I refer to as the maturation of the anti-colonial movement. And in several countries in Africa and some of Asia, the national liberation movements in the struggle for anti-colonial struggle and struggle for independence and self-determination. One of the things as I was reflecting on and preparing to present here was very instructive that this teacher of mine left the profession, I mean, just around the same, I think just after the time that he taught us, and migrated to the US. And there later I found out that he had actually joined the US Army, and he was one of those, I think he became part of the Green Beret, who did one or tours of duty to fight for democracy in Vietnam. So that was my early perhaps early attempt to indoctrinate me in terms of what was democracy and the whole concept of democracy, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Indeed, several years later, as a youth activist, youth leader, and also labor leader, because at the age of 27, I was an executive member of the St. Lucia National Youth Council, and of course, the general secretary of the largest public sector union in St. Lucia at the time. And I can tell you both streams, both in terms of the youth movement and in the labor movement, we were engaged in conversations with the government. Hello? We were engaged in conversations with the government, we engaged in protest actions, we engaged in struggles for change, for a number of things. So in essence, I came face to face with this concept of democracy and reflecting on what my teacher sought to get me to understand in terms of it being a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And here am I, several years later, in this struggle, in this situation as a youth leader, youth activist, labor leader, supposedly engaging in some kind of activism, struggle for justice and social justice, within what is supposed to be a space that is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. It indeed was a period of time as well where clearly one saw a divergence, a dichotomy between what was actually shaping or what was actually populating the government's agenda and what were the needs of the people, what were people's sense of what was fair and just. And of course, it was also a time where the state felt it was obligated, or it had the justification, as they would sometimes say in the public pronouncements, to use state violence to suppress the views and the voices of the people. Albeit not the entire people, but of course a significant section, a significant body of the people. So I am thinking, hey, we are the people, and we are letting you know how we feel. We are letting you know that economically we are not getting our share. We are feeling socially excluded. When adjustments are being made based on economic and fiscal constraints that may emerge, we who are the more economically marginalized, poor and indigent, seem to be the ones carrying the brunt of that economic adjustment, or even some of the social intervention. And we are saying this to you, supposedly in a space what you call democracy. And so we the people are saying, hey, the government of the people, what is happening? But the government of the people, by the people, for the people, is actually using state violence to suppress the voice, the cries, the dreams, the aspirations of the people. And so these things, you know, obviously these things had me thinking a lot. I mean, you know, what is this really this thing that we call democracy? What is it? You know, am I being taken for a ride? That it's supposed to be this, you know, this wonderful notion, and you know, and I'm supposed to be, you know, in it and existing and supposed to be happy about it. And the reality is a different situation. And what has happened between even now, even more recently, and over the years, I think Katarina made mention to an important point. A lot of common sayings, I refer to them. You heard them as pronouncements on public and political platforms. You heard them as pronouncements in terms of encapsulating what turns out to be or what are intended to be public policies. And those sayings in many ways, I think a way that some of those public officials, the government and other representatives in their own way try to encapsulate the concept we may be all in the storm, but we have different boats. So you hear concepts like we are all in. You hear exhortations to people that, oh, it's about the national good. We must all be interested in protecting the national good. We hear slogans about one people and one destiny. You know, we is one people, we are one people, it's one destiny. We talk about the homogeneity. You know, we is one, we know we're not different, we is one. We have concepts of the people's government. You have elected us, so we are the people's government. Then you hear in moments of fear and moments of crisis, you hear, let us put our shoulder to the wheel. Let's put our shoulders to the wheel. Presumably, all of us are to benefit from the way the wheel turns, and we all must put our shoulder to this wheel. Then there appeals sometimes for us to address certain issues. And the appeal is our common enemy. We must all rally against our common enemy. Calls of one nation, we are one nation, we're not different, we're together. In the Caribbean, they will tell you, all of we is one. All of we is one, we is one boy, you know, we're not different, kind of thing. Then you see in sometimes more formalized slogans that sometimes make up national, some national slogan. You see concepts like together we aspire and together we achieve. And so in my own experience, from a deficit perspective, then it means that the power is not distributed, but that is a disequilibrium. And so I often say to people, yes, the manifestations we see, gender-based violence, youth marginalization, economic marginalization of certain social classes and socioeconomic groups, whether it's ethnic, those things. And one of them in the power relationships, in the power structures in our society, right? The other issue, which I think points to and underpins and shapes those issues that we've spent so much time trying to address, engaging in discourse, dialogue, and protesting, whatever, and what I refer to as the concept of structural inequality, those structural inequalities in our systems and in our society. And I must say that those who benefit from the status quo have done a very good job in illusions. So for instance, I was at this conference They were discussing for young people. And there was this talk about, well, young people are not getting work and they're not getting employed because too many old people are in the labor market. And I chose to challenge that notion. And I said, look, bear in mind, I am not suggesting that organizations should not engage in proper transitioning programs and ensuring that young people, I am not saying that young people not to be engaged, but we must be careful that we do not allow ourselves to be misled. Because here it is, you have a situation where unemployment in many of those countries are significant, in some cases over, some cases almost 50%, some cases over 20%, okay? And if you look at it proportionate to other, is 2.5 to 3 times. All of the statistics are out there. But I said, let's look at it. Do you believe if they say, okay, we have early retirement, and we ask all the people above a certain age to get out of the labor market, go home, go and relax, let the young people take over. I said, do you believe that in of itself an intervention will solve the problem of unemployment? It will not solve the problem of unemployment, because we are looking at something which can only perhaps have an incremental impact on the issue. And that is, so I had to use that discourse, that dialogue, that example to emphasize this thing of structural inequality and make the point to persons who are involved in advocacy, persons who are involved in movements, persons who are involved in political activism, to say to them that even while you want to, your messaging, you want to be able to talk about what people know, they want to know what is the percentage of unemployment, and they want to know what is the percentage of indigence. You want to appeal to the emotional aspects of unemployment and whatever. The reality of the situation, that we will not be able to address those things unless and until we are able to address and deal with the structural inequalities. So whether it's gender-based violence, whether it's gender inequity, whether it is youth marginalization, these are all products of one, like I said, the disequilibrium in power, and two, the structural inequalities. There are structural inequalities that are driving, that are informing those, right? And if I were to be more formal, I would tell you what I have deduced from the literature and some of the writers. Some of them seem to stay far from this notion of structural inequality, but here is one here. Structural inequalities pose severe challenges for sustainable development, in that it perpetuates cycles of poverty, indigence, social exclusion, and violence. And it is both a product and a facilitator of deformed political processes and imbalances in the traditional power structures. Okay, so there's a linkage between the imbalance, the disequilibrium in the power structures in our society and the notion of structural inequality. Yeah. According to Leach et al. 26, the issue of rising inequality and what to do about it looms large in the minds of government. Okay, and addressing inequality is key. So even in this, what I would call a more normative discussion around structural inequality, they are recognizing, not just Leach et al., but others are recognizing that addressing inequality is key to eradicating things like poverty, okay, to fostering transformations that we talk about, promoting social progress, reducing conflict and violence, and of course, like they say, developing more inclusive governance. And inclusive governance, of course, whereas they have some very normative concepts of it, inclusive governance is really about creating an equilibrium in power, in the power relations. Inclusive governance will not and cannot be achieved if it is that your power structures remain and do not have the kind of balance and equilibrium. You will not be able to achieve it. You could call it what you want, but you'll not be able to achieve. Also, it's interesting to note that, like I said, and something that often happens, that we always have to keep our eyes open. There is a point where in the development space and discourse, where those things that need to be dealt with in terms of the, not just the surface, but digging deeper and dealing with what we have to interrogate if we are to achieve the kind of transformation what we're looking for. That by the time, you know, the movement in terms of people begin to speak about them, there is a way that in the development space, they are abrogated and people begin to give them a, you know, make it look like it is embraced. I know we understand it. So in the 2030 Development Agenda, in the preamble, it says we pledge that no one will be left behind. Essentially, they're saying that, hey, we need to dismantle all of this structural inequality and we need to create equilibrium power. But do you think that the governments, those persons who believe in this elitist approach to power, who holds power, okay, the governments plus some of those that Katrina has just showed us, you think that is truly what they believe? This is what this is supposed to be saying, but do we just become complacent and say, well, the SDGs, the preamble says this, and oh my, let the SDGs go. It is a wonderful document. It's a wonderful instrument. The World Economic Forum Outlook raised questions about rising extreme inequality. Say it's a concern for us all. Yeah. Goal 10 of the SDGs seeks to address specifically the issue of inequality. Right? So it is now part of the discourse, part of the development thing. There's a document I came across, the World Social Science Report 2016, says that economic and political power are increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small number of people. And they argue that this can threaten both social cohesion and the health of democracy. Indeed, they claim that reducing democracy is a requirement for human rights and justice, and is essential for success in other global priority areas, such as environmental sustainability, conflict resolution, migrations with all of its implications. Katrina spoke about stateless people and others. Right? And they went on to make the point that inequalities should not be understood and addressed only in relation to income inequality, as serious as that is, and in wealth. Their position is that inequality, okay, and the whole notion of inequalities and how it is challenging us, it cuts across economic, political, social, cultural, environmental, spatial, and even in knowledge and knowledge generation. So indeed, what they're saying is that the whole concept of inequality is very pervasive. They're recognizing that we face serious issues in terms of development, in terms of social cohesion, in terms of the health of democracies, quote unquote, if we do not address the issue of inequality. And what are some of the definitions that they have afforded us in terms of structural inequality? One is that structural inequality refers to a system where prevailing social institutions offer an unfair or prejudicial distinction between different segments of the population in a specific society. And that such unfair distinction is rooted in social practices, laws, and regulations, as well as in government policies and politics, which may eventually cause consequences in terms of access to equal or fair opportunity in socio-political and economic sphere. Why I found that definition particularly interesting and should be an eye-opener and should encourage us to keep our eyes open is because structural inequality does not always come riding in a Cadillac with fancy colors and whistles blowing that we recognize it. It can be very insidious, yeah? So it requires us to be looking deeper. Even in supposed supposed decent global frameworks that are with all of the fancy language that are intended to, create change and create, empowerment and those things. It behooves us to look at, like we say in contract law, look at the fine print. It puts on us an obligation to interrogate social policies, social public policies, social legislation and others, because the structural inequality, like I say, does not always come with a horn and making noise and say, here it's structural inequality. It's very insidious. And I think that definition captures it well. It's very insidious. And it requires one to interrogate those policies, those structures, those things. Some of them we have become so accustomed that we almost just play a kind of blind eye, not necessarily realizing how damaging they are in terms of undermining the whole process of transformation, undermining issues of equity and equality and those things in society. So there also is a lot of discussion about where does it occur, okay? So structural inequality occurs in and is reinforced by unequal relations in rights, social policies, societal roles, functions, decisions, opportunities. For example, laws can potentially construct, not just construct, but also reinforce the structural forms of inequality. Hence the reason why I make the point that we are to always examine those, okay? They are sometimes systematically rooted in the normal operations of dominant social institutions. The state, there is that notion that the state is this arbiter, that the state is this impartial observer. The reality of the situation, as you look at the dynamics of public policy, the dynamics of the space, the issue of power, then you begin to realize that the state is not this partial arbiter, that the state as the body, as a frame, as an institution of government and governance, may very well be this dominant institution that is perpetuating the structural inequalities and by extension facilitating the disequilibrium in the power relationships. And that even worse, when those who are the victims of the structural inequality and of the political disequilibrium decide to make demands for a change or make demands for there to be equity, that very state that is sometimes perceived as the arbiter then clearly shows its hand. It then becomes a weapon in the hands of those who are controlling power, yeah, to be able to suppress the wishes and the aspirations of those persons who are seeking at least seeking their share of the cake, for want of a better phrase. And then you start to ask yourself to go back again, a government for the people, by the people. What are we talking about, right? You know? So how can we identify structures that cause inequalities? It is difficult to identify the structures that cause inequality precisely because the discrimination is embedded oftentimes in what we call the normal operations, right? So that the manifestations of inequality, for example, in unemployment, appears through access, through quality, right? And unequal structures can be defined by recognizing the significant gaps, particularly in employment, social integration, or the creation of an enabling environment. From a youth perspective, let me give one example that we see very much. I remember during my time working in the Commonwealth Secretariat in the Caribbean and in largely Africa as well. So we have this huge problem of presumably of youth unemployment. And it emerged that, well, you know, the way to address this thing is for us to youth entrepreneurship. Yes, you know, we put some money, we teach them young people how to be entrepreneurs, and we give them a little stipend to go and set up a business. Yeah. That is without interrogating what is the economic dynamic in the society? How the issue of power has created a dominant control of economic relations within our society. Okay? A situation where economic activity is linked to political action. So those who are the dominant economic players are financing the political players, right? And therefore the political players, their existence depends on those economic players. And therefore that translates into public sector investment being largely carved out among, you know, a certain group of economic players in society, right? So you send out some young people out there, you say you train them on economic. How do you expect this to translate into some movement that will then change, transform the imbalances that exist in terms of economic power, economic activity, economic control? If, as we said before, the state is an independent arbiter, why hasn't the state decided, okay, we are serious about youth unemployment, that there is an inequality, the young people are not, the employment we need to get them in. We are going to invest in youth entrepreneurship. Therefore, what we're going to do, we are going to amend our procurement legislation or something so that we can ensure that, because in many of our countries, a public sector investment is the largest source of revenue for the private sector. All this notion about private sector leading the economy, maybe in the US, and even in the US, many of the private sector elements depend upon state spending. They have set up shop in Washington to benefit from the military expenditure from all of those areas. So in our space, the public sector, government remains the major source of economic activity and revenue for most of the private sector. So it means if we are talking about addressing this, if we're talking about and doing away with the structural inequalities, then it means the state has the power to make certain decisions, okay, that can create some level of equilibrium. But do they? That's the question I would probably let you just say, right? So that, and this is exactly what I was referring to. So that in terms of trying to deconstruct the whole question of structural inequalities, we need a number of interventions. One is what I've just referred to, the question of public interventions. One sometimes may even call it affirmative action programs, okay, to create an equilibrium in the society. But then that requires a certain commitment on the part of the state and the state apparatus, okay, in terms of their understanding and they committing themselves to the dismantling of the disequilibrium in the power structures, and also in terms of undermining the existing structural inequalities in society. Are they prepared to do that? Have we seen signs of that? Can we sit and wait for them to do that? These are questions that you should ask. And Antonio Guterres, the SG of the United Nations, seemed to believe that it's an urgent agenda item addressing structural equality. He calls for a new social contract within the societies. He says a social contract that will enable people to live in dignity, calls for education and digital technology to become the great enablers and equalizers. And reflecting on Guterres's interventions to address structural inequalities. And I'm listening to Katarina, I'm saying, hey, Katarina Dunn has the answer for him already. Are these really going to create the equilibrium we're talking about, unless there is something else added to it. Okay? He says that people want social and economic systems that work for everyone. These are lofty, the point I want to make with those things, there is a lofty statement. These are lofty ideals. I do not want to say that, Guterres is wasting his time. I do not want to say that he is shooting in the dark. I think, it makes for a very good public statement. The reality of this situation is that as noble as these are, the whole dynamic, the way of dismantling the structural inequalities does not lie with lofty statements at the United Nations. They do not lie with well-intentioned public officials. As much as we are happy for them, they help create a certain climate, political, they give ammunition to political and social activists to go out there and to continue the activism. There is a lot more that has to be done. Okay, I will skip to and this is what takes me to the whole question of social justice and social justice movements, what I call a democratic imperative. Okay. Indeed, the concept of social justice, which is part of what Antonio Guterres was referring to, and several other statements going way back to the Copenhagen Declaration, going to the Beijing Declaration, and a number of global statements. The SDGs themselves are purporting to address this question of social justice. But are they accepting that social justice is what I call a politically charged concept? that social justice does not just lie in those wonderful, lofty statements that we make. That social justice is a politically charged concept. That social justice is something of a, is largely of a political objective that requires certain types of interventions and actions by those, by us, by people, wherever they are. And it's not one set of people. It is about people who are displaced, whether it's by migration, whether it's people who feel offended by climate change, people who feel they are treated based on labor relations. It is people in the favelas. It is gender, people who are taking action to create space for gender equality. It is a whole political global movement, local and global movement, that need to deal with this question of social justice, and brings me to the concept of solidarity. Okay, so what are some of the writers saying about this thing of social justice? In fact, Finn and Compson, some way back in the beginning of the millennium, said that a commitment to social justice is becoming increasingly urgent. Interestingly, at the beginning of the millennium, Finn and Jacobson are saying that a commitment to social justice is becoming increasingly urgent. They only recognized that then, when for several of us who live under colonialism, from way back in the Caribbean, from slavery and post-emancipation, we have been struggling. We have been struggling for social justice, for economic empowerment and those things. But it is only in 2003, at the beginning of the millennium, Finn and Jacobson is saying it's becoming increasingly urgent. Then Rubin in 2010 made the point that the ideas surrounding social justice and what it involves are diverse, meaning that social justice is an essentially contested concept with different philosophical, political, and practical orientations. And I share Rubin's viewpoint, because you have a whole diverse population of agencies and organizations with different notions of social justice. Not until you start to interrogate, one, what are the philosophical perspectives informing the concepts of social justice? Two, what are the interventions around this notion of social justice? You then start to realize, hey, what is really going on, You may even realize that some supposed interventions for social justice are really nothing but just what I would call in medicine, what they call it, they have a placebo. It's a way of these are sometimes the measures that are used to allow people to disengage. So if a movement is seeming to reach this critical point where the action must be taken, you may then get in the public policy space, people embracing social justice, governments and others, make it appear as though they have understood and we now are converted and we are going to pursue social justice. And as soon as there is a disengagement, you start to ask yourself, but wait a minute, where is this commitment to social justice? We need also to understand, yeah?
Yeah, if you can kindly wrap up in this next 7 minutes or so, so that kind of the rest of the time.
Yeah. We need also to understand, as I was just going to point out, that there are several, when we talk about social justice, there's several manifestations. I think some of them Katrina mentioned in her presentation. I wouldn't think much on this, but so if you say wrap up, let me just on the question of social justice is also the point we made about social movements. Some people have the view that the heights of the 1960s and 70s, which was heights of global activism around social justice and social justice movements, that there has been a waning of social justice movements. Some are very pessimistic in that they believe that is responsible for the relative success of the right wing and other types of neoliberal agendas that seem to be plaguing much of our world. That is something one can think. But I'll fast forward. Just to fast forward. I also wanted to just share some, that's not new to you. Some manifestations of social justice movements, the issues that they deal with. I think Katarina made mention of some before, the Black Lives Matter movement. You had this in India. This was protests around the issue of rape and the relative what they call it, relative tardiness of the state in addressing the issues of rape. Movements around the issues of climate change, some of what Black Lives Matter. Often in the Caribbean context, it's in the current iteration of social movements and social justice and what is happening, often the discourse and the organizations and the players, they neglect to mention or to highlight the role that the Rastafarian community, Rastafarian movement has played, especially in a Caribbean context, in terms of promoting this whole concept of social justice. I mean, indeed, outside of slavery, the Rastafarian movement has been the most brutalized set of people and state brutality against them. There are cases in Dominica, for example, in Dominica, in St. Lucia, in Jamaica, of issues that could have amounted to actual genocide against the Rastafarian community. Of course, also, there was a point where the labor movement, which had played a very significant role over the years in terms of social justice, I think, to create some level of equity. I mean, it has experienced its own challenges, but we cannot forget the role that they have played. And of course, the movement against war, I mentioned in 1968 when the teacher was saying this, it was the time of the Vietnam War, but issues of war, as we see recently, and the movements against war remains a fairly recognizable aspect of the social justice movement. What are some critical issues I find, which I'm going to round up here, for social justice movements? Because the point is, to me, we cannot depend upon the goodwill of government. We cannot depend on the good intentions or the kindness of governments or global and international agencies. I believe that the issues of structural inequalities, issues of the power imbalances, the issues of lack of equity, the issues of poverty, the issues of human rights and all of those things will best be addressed with the whole question of solidarity among people, okay, solidarity among people, with global solidarity of movements, social justice movements, and the lot. But based on what I have seen, in closing, I just want to say a couple of points I think very critical for these social justice movements. One, the issue of the clarity of purpose. In my own experience being in the movement, people need to understand, you need to clearly define what is your purpose, okay? Clarity of purpose is important. Another important thing, and it's linked to the clarity of purpose, is a question. Are those movements acting opportunistically in terms of, do they just swim with the tide? Or is it that they have some core values for which they are prepared to stand? Okay. Do they also understand in a real, when I say they, I'm talking about the movements and those who make up the movement. the leadership and others, do they always also understand what it is they are up against? Is there a vision of change? So oftentimes in those movements, we know what we are against, but do we also have a vision for change? What is that alternative? Because my own experience is that if you have a vision, if you can espouse a vision, if you can articulate a vision, there's a greater likelihood that you could move people against what you say is toxic and not relevant, because you can point them to a vision rather than getting people to be against it. And of course, how do you conceptualize power? So that are we aware if in our movement that there is a disequilibrium in the power structures? And are we addressing this, or are we chasing the red herrings, what we perceive to be the issues, right? Is the tail wagging the dog? So coming back to the point about democracy and democratic traditions, are our movements, our social movements who are seeking to create a new arrangement, a new social contract, are we ourselves perpetuating the same foolishness of what I call elitist concepts of power, where we believe power is to be held by a one leader or a couple of leaders, and that the mass of the movement is not involved? Do we always know who our allies are? Because part of the challenge, I think, in movements, in that space, we're talking about trying to address human rights and create more democratic processes, is we don't always seem to know who our allies are. We seem to be too many silos and not solidarity, okay, not solidarity. And of course, the hallmark of all of them is the simultaneous action, sometimes not simultaneous, sometimes strategically one may follow the other, remains true. The idea of agitating, the idea of educating, but of course the idea of organizing. And how do we define success? How do we, if we are in a movement, a youth movement, a social movement, a justice movement, how do we know we have been successful? Do we celebrate our success? Do we build upon our success? How do we perpetuate? How do we in a sense, create that sustainability? That has been a challenge for social justice movements. It has been part of the Achilles heels of social justice movements. And those movements are so very much so well needed now and going into the future if we are to achieve what we're talking about in terms of this active global citizenship, this great idea of democracy and democratic traditions, and to be able to address issues of human rights, whether they are human rights generally, or we're talking about children and youth rights, or we're talking about rights from a perspective of gender or environmental or whatever those rights are. Well, I rest my case, and you are the jury. we'll judge it.
quite an interesting, very, very elaborative lecture, and I have followed the lecture from last year to now. I think this is one of the best I have attended. I'm very grateful to these two speakers. From Katarina, who gave us a brief overview from civic education down to global education, and I know the whole concept. To you, Dr. Henry, who is now asking us, are we perpetuating what we are speaking against? I think on a very personal level, that's one of the questions I'm asking myself. For the things that I speak against, am I also not perpetuating them? That's a very reflective question to ask myself. But I'll let the participant to now ask us questions. We can take about 3 or so questions for the speakers. Participants, any question on your mind? There were a couple of them on the chat. I lost the chat, but I had to go out and come in again. But I saw that Dr. Popovic answered quite a number of them there as well. But if there's anybody who want to speak and ask a question now, this is the floor and this is the time. Just show by hand and I'll mention your name and then let us have your question. Anybody has a question?
Should I come back to the questions that I offered? Counter questions?
Yeah. And then I think that will do, so that we can use those ones to wrap up. Yes.
Yes, yes. Let me just share it. And until I manage to come back to them, maybe just to comment something that we have discussed briefly in the chat, the feeling of not having hope, really. We were, both Henry and I, quite critical about the global tendencies, UN and SDGs and so on, and working in UN, you know, for a few years already, you can really become depressed. Oh gosh, there is no. And but then we should observe the things in a global range, in the broader development, in a longer time. And then you see the changes are happening, not always the way we want and the way we fight for them and so on, but they are happening. And especially when it comes to global governance, UN and the other organizations, what is the option? Just to leave them, to make them disappear, and then to have a world with one of two big global sheriffs or things like this? So this is the fight that we cannot give up. And also fighting together, we see our small contribution and we don't see immediate results. But, you know, really social movements that Henry was describing so well, and all those initiatives from community level to the global level and global efforts together, I think that gives us really a hope. As I mentioned, it will not happen maybe exactly when we want. Well, it will be tomorrow, the better world. But so on a longer scale, probably, yes, that's working towards that is the contribution. And well, I found it. Okay, here it is. So of course, they could be, I think, very good connected to the Henry's point about this approach, being it to the citizenship or to the human rights, to social justice, social movements. Your experiences on that, if you had some, and if you would like to reflect on them and share with us. Or what do you see as a challenge or as a problem? This being a bit frustrating is one of them that we discussed in the chat, but maybe there are furthers. What do you see as the biggest obstacle or the biggest challenge or the biggest problem? And where do you see possibility for actions? You personally or your organizations or in your country or more globally and so on. And where do you see additional, maybe some hope and some positive tendencies in what Henry and I were talking about?
Fellow participant, are you there with us? Anybody want to share thoughts now?
Does anyone have or had some experiences with social movements or any kind of initiatives locally, nationally, globally, actions? Local actions or protests maybe, or demonstrations, or environmental actions, social movements, smaller or bigger? Or is it quite new for you?
Most of the participants here are student leaders who I believe have had issues of this kind, who have handled their own type of campaigns, their own type of demonstrations in various ways. So any of them that can share any thoughts will be very, very, very appreciated.
Yeah, I think if Katarina would ask the question again, because I think I have something to share.
Oh, okay. So the question, and I can also put them in the, I can share them again. Here. So for example, your experiences in any kind of social movements, social activities, environmental activities, demonstrations, local community actions, and so on, if you could share or reflect. What do you think about approaches that Henry and I offered here? What do you see as the biggest problems in the topics we were talking about? What is the biggest challenge or the biggest problem? What do you personally see as a big problem? As something that you would say, oh gosh, so how can we solve that? And where do you see hope? And what could you do?
Okay, I think as a student leader at some point we tried to hold a protest that was very friendly, because we tried to work with the structures that were there to, pass the information we were trying to pass, but it didn't work. So we decided to use a different approach, which was to do a small demonstration and just to have the administration give us an ear. But one of the things that made us fail is the inequality in structures. You are a student leader, you are student leaders, but the structure does not recognize you as people who are supposed to help them in making decisions that affect students. So when you come up with initiatives to now let the students join you in airing out whatever it is you're trying to air, then it becomes a problem, and that is where the police officers are brought in and student leaders are arrested and so on and so forth. So I think the challenge that we have is the inequality in structures, where there are particular people that are recognized, there are others that are not recognized as part of the system. And then also in terms of funding, just like Katarina was saying during her presentation, is that a lot of it is, sorry to say this, but propaganda. Because when we say that education is the key to everything and we give it very little funding, then it means we don't have it at heart. It's just stories and stories and stories. So still that goes back to inequality in structures. So the whole thing goes back to inequality in structures. Yes.
Okay, Dr. Henry has his hand up.
Yeah, well, Shirin raised a very, very critical thing there, because a couple of things I want to say. One, governments in the global community, they have, and they are supposed to be subscribing to this notion of the democratization of education, meaning that of student participation. Okay, they have signed on to those things. Secondly, most of them have actually, it is the most ratified convention in the world. That is the 1989 Convention, the Rights of the Child. Okay, and most of them in that context, they have this issue of the rights of the right of the child. And of course, that goes up to 18 and whatever. But I'm saying the frame in terms of what you call a child rights education concept, in terms of recognizing the right of the students, they are supposedly bought into it as well. Another quick point is that, and I omitted to mention before, even from a youth perspective, while sometimes we get the feeling that governments and UN and others must come. Interestingly, on November the 10th in 1945, just around the end of the Second World War, hundreds of students met in London. They met in London, representing hundreds of countries, met in London to discuss the World War and the impact it had on young people's education and young people's lives and all of those things, and took a clear position that the youth of the world was not going to allow the world to go back into any global war and all of that, and set up a structure that time which was called the World Federation of Democratic Youth going forward. I say that because, interestingly, it was not until 20 years later, in 1965, did the global community, in terms of governments and the United Nations, pass any resolution recognizing the role of young people in development. And I'm telling you that not to give you a history lesson, but to tell you that young people have always been, and it remains today, you need to be the ones who are going to be the torchbearers. It has a price. The police may arrest you, like they say. You don't have to let the police arrest you. I ain't advocating you're going to let the police arrest you. But there were two things involved. In 1945, there was solidarity. We need to build that solidarity. Those of you in the student movement need to see what is happening to young people in terms, there's a link between the student movement and what's happening to young indigenous people? What's happening to young people who are migrants, who are stateless, like things said? And we need to find ways of creating that solidarity in terms of, you know, making broad demands. Our demands are not just in quality of education, but also in terms of access to and other things like that. Yeah.
Great. Dr. Katarina, something you want to add before we wrap up?
I couldn't agree more. And what I would like to share is also the experience I made in peace movement in my region. My country was involved in a civil war. And after that, we had a kind of an authoritarian regime. I would even call this dictatorship for several years. You know, I spent years and years on the streets, protesting and demonstrating and so on. And there were students, my students, I was already professor at the university, but then when students joined, we were, you know, we were growing and growing. I mean, you know probably how dictatorship works. They have usually police, they have army, they have economic power. Structural inequalities are very strong. I remember I shared this with my students, so I can really, I empathize with what was shared. But then, you know, we kept going on and on, although it was really frustrating. And on one day, we were 1 million on the street, many of them young people, many of them young people. And it was the day when the dictator was done, he was over. So we won. And I can tell you, this is probably one of the most beautiful days in my life. You were even like, oh gosh, we will never win, but you keep going on and on. And this power, this energy, I mean, it was intergenerational, but you know, when you spent like 4 months on the street demonstrating continuously, really continuously, literally. So then you need really the energy of young people, and you need this feeling of we belong to the community of values, human rights, democracy, justice, equalities, and we will prevail, or we shall prevail. I still stick to that.
I think your story summarized it all for us, but especially for our students who are going through the same things we went through years ago. We are still fighting some authoritarian rule. We are fighting against high cost of data for ourselves. We are doing a lot of campaigns around the world. This your story. It's a very inspirational one. And I think all of us to take a cue from that. Thank you very much, Dr. Katarina Popovic, Dr. Henry Charles, for such an exciting educative session you're giving to us today. Democracy, human rights, active global citizenship education. Thank you so much for enlightening us today. We are very, very, very grateful. Well, you have to ask for permission that we want to share this video with our other colleagues who are not here with us, who can also watch and learn from this sessions. And thank you very much for nodding so almost immediately. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, participants, also for making the time. I think our next session will be in 2 weeks or less. So looking forward to seeing all of you. Thank you so much and have a great day wherever you are.
Bye-bye. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.